I have lived in the Montana backcountry for 5 quiet years, long enough that the world beyond these pines and ridgelines feels distant and unnecessary, a place I once belonged to, but no longer have the courage or desire to return to. Up here, the only things that make sense are the wind scraping across the valley, the steady pulse of snow hitting the cabin roof, and the rhythmic breathing of Ranger, my Belgian Malinois, the only living creature who still trusts me without question. I brought him home after leaving the Air Force, but somewhere along the way it became clear he was the one keeping me alive. On the night everything changed, the forecast warned of a blizzard nasty enough to shut down the entire county. I had sealed the shutters, checked the propane tanks, stacked wood by the stove, and tried convincing myself that the storm outside matched the one I carried inside. I was halfway through tying down a loose section of tarping when Ranger lifted his head from the rug. Ears, pointed body, going stiff. Then came the sound he rarely made, a deep, vibrating growl that rolled from his chest like a warning shot. I froze. Ranger never growled without reason. I stepped toward the door, zipped my coat, and pulled my headlamp from the hook, and before I even touched the doorknob, Ranger was already standing beside me, tail still, eyes locked on something only he could sense. The wind hit me like a slab of ice when I opened the door, howling across the porch with enough force to sting my eyes. Snow blew sideways in fast, angry sheets, blurring the fence line 30 yards out. Ranger trotted into the cold, nose up, scanning the air. I muttered under my breath and followed, crunching through the new snow, each step heavy and unwelcome. I had made myself a promise when Hannah died that I would never again answer anyone's call for help. I had spent a career rescuing strangers in impossible places, but when the one person I loved most needed saving, I had failed. Since then, I wanted nothing to do with heroics, emergencies, or anything resembling a mission. But Ranger did not care about the vow I made to myself. He cared only about what he sensed. Halfway to the fence, the beam of my headlamp caught something white snapping violently in the wind. I walked closer, and as the snow parted for a moment, I saw it clearly, a strip of soft beaded fabric tangled around a splintered post. When I freed it, the delicate stitching glimmered under the light and my stomach tightened. It was a wedding veil. Not cheap or homemade, expensive, purposeful. Worn by someone whose life had taken a turn so wrong that pieces of her wedding attire were now blowing across my land in the middle of a blizzard. Before I could think, the veil whipped out of my hand and took flight, spiraling into the storm like it was trying to escape something. Ranger barked once sharp and urgent, then sprinted uphill toward the abandoned chapel sitting crooked above the ridge. I stared after him, breath fogging in the air, heart sinking with the cold realization that someone out here needed help, whether I wanted to give it or not. I whispered the truth aloud, the same truth I had repeated to the empty cabin for years. I was not looking to save anyone. The truth was, I could not even save myself, but Ranger was already disappearing into the storm, and he had never once been wrong. I pushed forward, boots sinking deep into the snow, as the wind climbed into a shriek. The chapel appeared through the whiteout like a broken skeleton, its roof half-collapsed, doors hanging by rusted hinges. Ranger scratched at the entrance and released a soft, trembling whine. Something was inside. Something alive. Something terrified. I tucked the veil into my coat, braced myself against the wind, and stepped toward the chapel door, knowing the moment I crossed that threshold, my quiet life would never be the same. I did not always live like a ghost tucked away in the Montana wilderness. There was a time when my life looked almost ordinary, or at least steady enough to convince myself that I had outrun the shadows of war and the things I had seen in the Air Force. I served 14 years in combat search and rescue, pulling wounded soldiers out of burning wreckage, carrying civilians through collapsed buildings, hovering in helicopters above places most people could not even point to on a map. I lived on adrenaline discipline and the belief that if I tried hard enough I could make the world just a little less cruel. Then, life reminded me that cruelty has its own plans. 5 years ago, Hannah. My wife, the woman who somehow saw past the parts of me I worked so hard to hide, died in a car accident on a rain-slick highway. One moment she was calling to say she would be home late, and the next moment the police were at my door with hats in their hands and apologies no one wants to hear. Losing her shattered something I did not know could break. The military trained me to survive explosions, ambushes, and impossible terrain, but nothing prepared me for a world without her. After the funeral, I tried to return to duty, but the nightmares grew sharper. Every rescue reminded me of the one I failed. Every scream over the radio sounded like hers. Eventually, I stepped away before I got someone killed through hesitation. I packed what little mattered, grabbed Ranger, who had been assigned to me during my last deployment, and drove until the roads disappeared into mountains and trees. The cabin I live in now was never meant to be a home. It was a hunting getaway built in the 70s, left to rot until I rebuilt it with shaking hands and too much silence. The locals in the nearest town know me only as the quiet veteran who buys supplies once a month and avoids conversation that lasts longer than a handshake. Ranger handles the socializing for both of us. I never planned to become someone who avoids the world. I fought against that change at first. But grief has a way of reshaping a man from the inside out, carving new walls, building new distances. People tried reaching out in the early years. Folks from town invited me to gatherings. A couple of my old teammates called, left messages, offered help. I appreciated it, but every time someone tried to come close, something inside me recoiled. It felt wrong to laugh, wrong to connect, wrong to exist in a world that continued moving when she no longer could. It was Ranger who sensed the worst of it. Dogs understand loss differently. He followed me everywhere, slept near me, nudged my hand when the nightmares dragged me awake. Sometimes I would find him sitting at the foot of the bed watching me with an expression that looked almost human, as if he knew that if he looked away, I might disappear. He is the only reason I still lace my boots in the morning. And on nights like this one, when the storm rattled the windows and the world felt like it was trying to erase itself, he reminded me that someone might still need me, even if I no longer believed I had anything worth giving. As I trudged up the ridge behind him, the wind cutting through my coat, I understood why I followed without argument. Ranger believed someone was out there. Ranger believed someone was in danger. And even though my chest ached with every breath and my mind tried to convince me to turn back, my body kept moving. Old instincts never really die. Fear, guilt, and grief had buried them, but not deep enough. I whispered into the storm that I was not ready to help anyone. The storm did not care. Ranger did not care, and a part of me, the part that once believed saving people mattered, rose painfully back to life as I climbed toward the ruined chapel, waiting in the snow. The chapel looked even more broken up close, as if time and storms had been chipping away at it for decades, waiting for a night like this to finally push it over the edge. Ranger stood rigid at the threshold, Hackle's raised ears pinned forward. His breath came out in sharp white bursts, and when he glanced back at me, I knew he had found something alive inside. I pushed the door with my shoulder, and the warped wood groaned before giving way. A wave of cold surged out so suddenly it took my breath. The inside looked like it had been abandoned mid-sermon 50 years ago. Pew benches lay crooked in the snow that had drifted through the broken windows. A collapsed beam leaned against the far wall. The air smelled of wet wood mildew and something else. Fear. Ranger moved first. He trotted between the pews, nose, low paws, silent despite the crunching snow. I followed, lifting my headlamp to scan the shadows. The beam swept across broken hymnals, shattered glass, and the peeling remnants of a mural that once showed angels. Now they looked like ghosts staring down disapprovingly. Then the light caught something unexpected. Satin. White. Still. I froze. Ranger whined softly. There, near the altar where the snow had gathered in a shallow drift, sat a young woman in a wheelchair. She was small, thinner than she should have been, wrapped in a wedding dress that looked ruined by the storm. Her shoulders trembled violently. Her dark hair clung to her cheeks in wet strands. The wheelchair was tilted at an awkward angle, one wheel half buried in snow, the other cracked near the axle. For a heartbeat, I wondered if she was alive. Then her eyes lifted to mine, wide and terrified, reflecting the harsh beam of my headlamp. She flinched at the light, raising one trembling hand as if expecting to be struck. The movement was so slow and weak that something inside me tightened painfully. I lowered the light and stepped closer. She watched me like a cornered animal, breathing shallow and fast. Ranger approached her gently, sniffing her hand, then resting his chin near her knee. She blinked at him in confusion and relief, touching the top of his head with fingers so cold they looked almost blue. Her lips parted as if forming a prayer. I crouched down beside them. Her voice came out cracked and barely audible. "Are you real?" Not a scream, not a plea, just that one question fragile enough to break in the air. "Yeah," I answered softly. "I am real. My name is Caleb. This is Ranger." Her eyes filled with tears the moment she knew she was not alone. She wiped them away with the edge of her sleeve, though her hands shook too hard to do it properly. I asked her name. "Lydia," she whispered. "Lydia Hale, 28. I asked what happened. It took her a long moment to gather the breath to answer. She said she had been at a mountain lodge just uphill from my land where a ceremony had been planned. She tried to say the words without falling apart, but even in the dim light I saw the truth fracture her expression. "I did not want to marry him," she said. "My family insisted. He insisted. I tried to leave, tried to get away before the vows. I made it as far as the service road before the wheelchair broke." There was no anger in her voice, only exhaustion, the kind that goes deeper than the body. I asked how long she had been out here. She shook her head. "I do not know. Hours, maybe more." I thought someone would come looking, but no one did. Her dress was soaked through, clinging to her skin like ice. Her teeth chattered so violently she could barely form words. I had seen hypothermia before. In soldiers pulled from rivers, civilians trapped in storms. The way Lydia's fingers curled inward told me she was already slipping toward the dangerous stages. I checked her pulse. Weak, but steady. She startled a little when I touched her wrist, then relaxed. "I am sorry," she whispered as if apologizing for existing. Ranger gave a soft nudge to her leg, sensing the panic under her skin. I slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back. Her body was feather-light but cold as stone. When I lifted her, she gasped in pain, her hands gripping my coat. "Sorry," she repeated, but the apology was for something bigger than the moment. I told her we needed to get her warm now. She nodded, trusting me instantly in a way that felt undeserved. Ranger circled us once, then led the way out of the chapel, weaving through the falling snow. The wind hit us with full force again, and Lydia buried her face against my shoulder. The veil in my pocket fluttered, with every step a reminder of how close she had come to dying alone. Her breath was shallow and fast. Her skin grew colder by the minute. I tightened my grip and walked faster. "You are going to be all right," I told her. Whether it was true or not, she needed to hear it. She made a faint sound that might have been a sob. Ranger stayed just ahead of us, checking back every few steps. The storm tried to push us off the path, but I kept moving, kept my footing, kept repeating silent commands to myself the way I used to during rescue missions. Do not stop. Do not slip. Do not let her go. Minutes later, the cabin lights emerged through the whiteout, a warm glow fighting against the blizzard. Lydia lifted her head just enough to see it. Relief washed across her face, softening the fear for the first time. "You are safe," I said. She closed her eyes and whispered something I barely heard. "Thank you." I tightened my hold on her and stepped through the storm toward the only shelter for miles, hoping it would be enough to save her. The warmth of the cabin hit us the moment I pushed the door open. A wave of heat rolling out from the wood stove that made Lydia gasp as if her lungs were relearning what warmth felt like. I carried her inside and set her gently on the couch closest to the fire. Ranger shook the snow from his coat and stationed himself beside her like he had appointed himself her personal guardian. I grabbed blankets from the cedar chest, wrapping them around her trembling shoulders and legs. Her wedding dress clung to her skin like frozen paper, and her teeth chattered in a desperate rhythm that made every word she tried to say fall apart. I told her to give me a moment, then heated water on the stove. When the kettle whistled, I poured it over ginger and honey, hoping the warmth would reach the places the blankets could not. She held the mug with both hands, though her fingers were so stiff I had to help her curl them around the ceramic. Steam rose into her face, softening the tension in her jaw. She took one shaky sip, then another, as if each swallow returned a piece of her back to herself. Ranger rested his head on the edge of the couch, staring up at her with an intensity reserved for people he decided mattered. When he gently nudged her elbow with his nose, Lydia let out a fragile laugh, the kind of sound that breaks easily. The storm outside slammed against the walls of the cabin, making the windows creak. We were sealed in by miles of blowing snow. No one was coming up the mountain that night. For better or worse, the world had shrunk to this small room, this fire, this injured stranger, this dog, and the silence between all of us. Once she had warmed enough to speak clearly, I asked about the pain in her back. She hesitated, tensing slightly as if bracing for judgment. She told me she had been injured months earlier in a hiking accident. Not paralyzed, but left with nerve damage severe enough that walking for long distances or standing for more than a few minutes sent sharp radiating pain down her legs. The wheelchair made things easier. But tonight, when she tried to escape the lodge, she hit a patch of ice and the left wheel snapped. She said she had dragged herself until she could no longer move, then found the chapel and prayed someone might pass before the storm swallowed her completely. I listened, watching the fire reflect in her eyes. There was truth in her voice, not rehearsed, not manipulative, just worn and raw. I asked why she had tried to run in the middle of winter. Her hands tightened around the mug. "Because I could not go through with it," she said. "My family arranged everything. The wedding, the guests, the expectations, and him." She did not say who he was, but the bitterness in her tone said enough. I asked if she had anyone she trusted. She shook her head slowly, unable to meet my eyes. The admission carried a weight that hung between us. I told her she could rest here until the storm passed. She nodded with a gratitude too big for her voice. While she sipped her tea, her gaze drifted across the room and stopped at the mantel. A framed photo sat there slightly tilted from where I had bumped it earlier. Hannah smiling the way she used to sunlight in her hair standing beside me during a summer barbecue. Lydia studied the picture with a softness I did not expect. She hesitated before asking, "Did you love her that much?" The question hit like a quiet blow. I swallowed hard, unsure whether I could answer without tearing something open. "Yes," I finally said, "more than anything." Lydia nodded, eyes shimmering with understanding rather than pity. She whispered that she was sorry for asking, but I shook my head. Ranger, sensing the shift, moved closer to her, and for the first time since we brought her in, he rested his head gently on her lap. She froze for a moment, startled by the unexpected affection, then touched the top of his head with both hands as if grounding herself. The simplicity of the gesture, the quiet acceptance from a dog who rarely let strangers near him, tightened something in my chest. The fire cracked loudly, sending a shower of sparks against the grate. Outside, the storm raged harder, making it clear we were trapped with nowhere to go. Yet, inside, the warmth spread. A fragile peace settled between us. Still, I could sense it. Something in Lydia's story did not line up. The gaps were small but noticeable, the kind of gaps someone leaves when they are telling the truth but not the whole truth. I did not press her. Tonight was about survival, not interrogation. She leaned back into the couch, her eyelids heavy from exhaustion. Her breath steadied. The color returned slowly to her cheeks. As she drifted toward sleep, she whispered that she felt safe here. She said it in a tone that made the room quieter, the fire softer, the air thicker with something unexpected. I watched her for a long moment, unsure why her words unsettled me. Maybe because it had been years since anyone looked at me with trust. Maybe because believing her felt dangerous. Maybe because, despite myself, I wanted to believe her. Ranger let out a small, content sigh and curled at her feet. The storm roared, but inside the cabin something warmer began to take root, delicate and temporary, like a flicker fighting against the wind. By morning, the storm had tightened its grip on the mountains, sealing us inside a world made of white and silence. Snow piled against the windows in thick drifts, and the wind pushed at the cabin walls as if it meant to take them down board by board. I added more wood to the stove, filling the room with a heat that smelled of pine and smoke. Lydia stirred slowly on the couch, her breathing soft and uneven. When she opened her eyes, confusion flickered across her face before recognition settled in. She looked around as if reminding herself she was somewhere safe and not lying alone in that collapsing chapel. Ranger rose immediately, stretching his front legs and lowering his head so he could nudge her hand. She smiled at him with a warmth I had not yet seen from her, a real smile, not the brittle one she had used while telling me pieces of her story the night before. I made oatmeal and poured her another cup of ginger tea. She ate quietly, movements careful, still stiff from the cold and her injury. When she finished, she held the mug in her lap and stared into the steam as if it held answers she had lost long ago. I asked her what she was thinking. She hesitated before saying she felt odd being somewhere peaceful. She said the lodge had been crowded, noisy, full of expectations, pressing down on her until she could not breathe. Here, despite the storm, she felt like she could finally exhale. I did not know what to say to that. Peace was something I had not recognized in years. She shifted slightly, adjusting the blanket around her legs, then glanced at the mantel again. This time, she did not ask about Hannah. Instead, she asked how long we had been married. 14 years, I said. Her eyes softened. That is a long time to love someone, she murmured. I nodded. The memories felt both heavy and distant, like photographs that had begun to fade at the edges. Lydia studied me for a moment, her expression careful. She said she could tell I had once been someone who carried entire rooms without realizing it, someone who made people feel safe. I almost laughed at that, but the sound caught in my throat. I told her that man was gone. She disagreed quietly. The way you carried me through the storm, she said. The way Ranger looks at you. That is not a man who has disappeared. Her words lingered in the space between us, unsettling something inside me I had worked hard to keep numb. I changed the subject and asked about her family. She let out a slow breath and explained how being a Hale came with rules she had no say in. Her parents saw her less as a daughter and more as an asset, a representative of the family's reputation. They believed the marriage she was supposed to enter would strengthen ties with another wealthy family. A merger disguised as a wedding. I asked if she loved the man she was meant to marry. She shook her head. Not even a little. Then why agree to it, I asked. She looked away, her eyes clouded. Because sometimes saying no costs more than saying yes. Those words sat heavily in the room. They sounded like someone who had spent too many years being bent but never allowed to break. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the shutters. Inside, the fire crackled steadily. For a long stretch of time, neither of us spoke. Then she asked about Ranger, how we met, how he became mine. I told her he had been assigned to me during my last deployment, trained to locate survivors in rubble and snow. She listened with such focus, it almost made me uneasy. When I reached the part about losing Hannah, about how I shut down afterward, she covered her mouth to hide a trembling breath. I had not meant to say that much, but something about the storm, the fire, the quiet presence of a stranger who asked without judgment, loosened the words until they slipped free. Lydia wiped at her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Not for prying, for your loss." I nodded, too tired to pretend it no longer hurt. Ranger, sensing the shift, moved closer and rested his head against my knee. Lydia leaned down with effort and brushed her fingers along his fur. She whispered that he seemed like the kind of dog who carried secrets and protected them. I said that was truer than she knew. Later, when the cabin grew warmer, she asked if she could help with anything. Her body was still weak, but she insisted on contributing. I handed her a wooden spoon and told her to stir the pot of soup gently so it would not burn. She held the spoon with both hands, steadying herself, determination flickering across her features. Watching her try, Watching her refuse to let her injury define her stirred something in me I had not felt in a long time. Admiration, maybe. Or something adjacent. When the soup was ready, we ate slowly, listening to the storm tear across the valley. The cabin lights flickered, then steadied. She looked at me over the rim of her bowl and said, "You and Ranger, you feel like home." I did not respond. I did not know how, but the silence between us was no longer heavy. It was gentle, almost warm, and for the first time in years, the storm outside did not feel like the only storm I carried. Night settled over the cabin with a heaviness that felt strangely peaceful after the hours of conversation, shared soup, and the quiet understanding that had built slowly between us. The storm continued outside, but its roars had softened, becoming more like distant waves than a threat pounding on the walls. Lydia fell asleep early on the couch, her breathing steady, her face finally free from the fear and tension that had marked it since I found her. Ranger positioned himself near her feet, keeping watch as if he believed she needed guarding long after the danger had passed. I banked the fire for the night and poured myself a small glass of whiskey, something to smooth the edges that had grown uneven from emotions I tried not to acknowledge. I sat at the table, letting the amber liquid burn a slow trail down my throat. The cabin creaked around us, adjusting to the temperature shift. The storm rattled the windows in soft bursts, but inside, everything felt calm. Too calm. After a while, exhaustion began to drag at my bones. I stood up, stretched my back, and checked the locks on the doors. Ranger lifted his head but did not follow me. He trusted the space enough to rest. I headed toward the bedroom, but something made me pause in the hallway. A faint sound. A rustle. Not loud, but enough to pull me back into that hyper-awareness carved into me by years of missions. Ranger had not reacted. That told me it was not danger, but it was something he noticed. Something he was choosing to observe, not challenge. I turned off the hallway light and let my eyes adjust. The moon, though nearly swallowed by clouds, cast a faint glow through the windows. I moved silently toward the living room, every step measured. When I reached the doorway, I froze. Lydia was no longer on the couch. She was standing. Standing. Her hands pressed lightly on the arm of the couch for balance, but she was upright. Weight distributed between her legs, no sign of the agony she had described. No sign of the helplessness I had witnessed when I carried her through the storm. She took a slow, careful step toward the window. Her posture was steady, her breathing calm. Ranger watched her with curious eyes, not alarmed, not confused. As if this version of her was not unfamiliar to him at all, my pulse hammered in my ears. I felt as if the floor had shifted under me. The woman I had risked my safety for, the woman who had trembled with pain, the woman who had cried into her tea, was now moving across my cabin with a strength she had never revealed, a strength she had hidden. She reached the window and rested her hand against the glass, staring out at the storm with an expression I could not decipher. Relief, maybe. Grief. Resignation. Then she whispered something so soft I might have imagined it. "I am so tired of lying." My chest tightened. I stepped forward and the floorboard creaked under my weight. Lydia gasped and spun around, her eyes wide with shock. She stumbled back a half step as if the act of being seen shattered the illusion she had been maintaining. Ranger stood, ears perked, sensing the rupture in the room. I stared at her, unable to mask the disbelief in my voice. "You can walk." The words came out colder than the wind outside. Lydia swallowed hard. Her lips trembled. "Caleb, I can explain." I let out a bitter laugh, one that scraped up my throat like broken glass. "Explain what?" "That everything you told me about your injury was a lie." She shook her head desperately. "No, not a lie. Not entirely. I can stand and walk short distances, but it hurts." "It really hurts." "The chair makes things easier. I never said I was paralyzed." "You let me assume," I replied. "You let me believe you could barely move." Her eyes filled with tears, but I felt nothing. No sympathy. No softness. Only the sharp rising burn of betrayal. "You carried me through the storm," she whispered. I could not tell you the whole truth, not then. You trusted me enough to let me in your home. I did not want to risk losing that, losing what I snapped. My protection. My pity. Her breath caught. No, not that. I needed somewhere safe. Somewhere that was not the lodge, not my family, not the life they keep trying to shove me back into. I shook my head. And you thought lying to me was the best way to get it. She stepped forward, wincing slightly but moving with a steadiness that destroyed the fragile trust we had built. I did not lie about everything she said. I was scared. I still am. You have no idea what you saved me from last night. I glared at her. And you have no idea what I walked away from years ago. What it took for me to try to believe someone again. She reached toward me, but I stepped back. The movement cut her deeper than any harsh word could have. Caleb, please, let me explain. I did not respond. Silence wrapped around us like ice. Ranger looked between us uneasy. Lydia's voice cracked. I am sorry. I should have told you. I wanted to. I did not know how without ruining everything. Everything. I repeated the word like a curse. Everything was built on a lie. She wiped her face with shaking hands. Then let me fix it. Let me tell you the parts I left out. I stared at her. Every instinct inside me wanted to walk past her, open the door, and let the storm take her back. But Ranger sat beside her, eyes soft, sensing her shame, her fear, and something else I refused to recognize. I turned away. I could not look at her any more. I walked toward the hallway without a word, the finality of my silence louder than any accusation I could have thrown at her. Lydia's breath hitched. Caleb, please. Nothing. I did not answer. I did not slow down. I closed the bedroom door behind me. Ranger remained in the living room, torn, whining softly. The last sound I heard before the night swallowed everything was Lydia collapsing to her knees, choking on sobs she tried to muffle in her hands. And then, hours later, when dawn thinned the storm and silence grew even colder than the night, I found the couch empty, the blankets folded neatly, and a letter resting where her body had been. Lydia was gone. The cabin felt different the moment I realized she was gone. Not colder, not quieter, just emptied in a way that went beyond sound and temperature. A space that had begun to feel occupied by more than just me and Ranger had suddenly reverted to the hollow, echoing shelter it had always been. The folded blanket on the couch hit me harder than the storm ever had. She had taken the time to smooth the corners to leave the fabric neat as if she believed leaving order behind would soften the chaos she had created inside me. Her letter sat on top, a single sheet folded once. My name was written on the front in a handwriting delicate enough to tremble. I did not touch it. I could not. Instead, I walked to the window and stared out at the snowdrifts that covered any footprints she might have left. The storm had erased them overnight, burying every trace of her departure. Ranger paced restlessly through the cabin, nose brushing the floor tail low. He whined softly near the door, then trotted back to the couch as if expecting her to return and reclaim the space she had occupied. When he realized she was not coming back, he approached me, nudged my hand, and looked up with eyes that asked a question I could not answer. I told him no, not sharply, not loudly, just the word, no. He lowered his head, uncertain. I could not give him comfort. My chest felt carved out, scraped hollow by emotions I had not been prepared to feel. Anger was easier than grief, and grief was easier than trust, and trust was something I never should have allowed to grow in the first place. I sat at the table staring at the letter from across the room. It stayed there, silent, patient, waiting for me to choose whether to learn what she had been too afraid to say while still standing under my roof. But I would not give her that. I refused to hear her reasons or her apologies. Let her words sit unopened, unread, unacknowledged. Let the silence be her answer. Let the silence be her punishment. The hours crawled by, each one, stretching longer than it should have. I tried to split firewood, but my hands shook too much to hold the axe steady. I tried to cook, but the sight of the second bowl on the counter made my chest tighten until I had to turn away. Every corner of the cabin felt haunted by what had happened, by the warmth she had briefly brought, by the cold truth she had left behind. Ranger stayed close but restless, moving between me and the door as if torn between staying and searching. At one point, he sat beside the unopened letter and let out a low whine, nudging it gently with his nose. I told him to leave it. He hesitated, ears flattening, then backed away. My voice cracked when I repeated the command. He noticed. He always noticed. By late afternoon, the storm had cleared completely. Sunlight stretched across the valley, glittering off the untouched snow. It should have been beautiful. Instead, it looked indifferent. The kind of day that moves on without acknowledging the people it bruises. I stood outside, letting the cold bite my face, letting the wind cut through the heat that had risen from frustration and betrayal. She was out there somewhere, limping through the snow with whatever strength she had left. I should have worried. I should have wondered whether she had shelter, warmth, safety, but I hardened myself instead. She had lied. She had broken whatever fragile trust had begun to form, and I had given her the only thing I had left to protect myself: silence. As dusk approached, Ranger lay on the rug near the couch she had slept on his ears, twitching at every imagined sound. I sat alone at the table, the untouched letter a few feet away, casting a shadow longer than it had any right to. And in that heavy, unbroken quiet, I realized something that tightened painfully inside my chest. My silence had not just punished her, it had punished me too. A week passed before anything shifted, before the silence I had wrapped around myself finally cracked under something heavier than anger. It happened on a morning when the world outside looked deceptively calm, the snow smoothed into soft hills and the sky washed in pale gold. I had just shoveled a path to the shed when I saw the envelope in the mailbox at the end of the drive. No one came up this mountain unless they had a reason, and no one delivered anything without my knowing. The envelope was thick, crisp, and too formal to belong in a place like this. My name was printed on the front, typed cleanly, no return address. I carried it inside, brushing the snow off my gloves, and sat at the table where Lydia's unopened letter still lay like a wound I refused to stitch. Ranger sat close, alert, sensing the shift in my breathing. I tore the envelope open. Inside was a notice from the bank, a statement, a confirmation. The loan on my cabin, the debt I had been chipping away at for years, the weight that had hung over me like a shadow since Hannah died, had been paid. Paid in full. My vision blurred for a moment, not from emotion, but disbelief. I read the document twice, then a third time, searching for any mistake, any explanation besides the obvious one rising in my mind like a tide. At the bottom of the page was the payer's name. Hale Industries. My pulse stumbled. The surname struck me like a physical blow. Hale. Lydia's name. Her family. The people she said had controlled her life, forced her into a marriage, used her as leverage. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady myself. Why would they pay my debt? Why would she? What did she think this was? A thank you, an apology, a transaction, a way to tidy up the mess she left behind. Or was it something else? Something she could not say in the letter I refused to open. Before I could make sense of it, Ranger barked sharply. Not out of alarm, out of excitement. He sprinted to the door where a small cardboard box had been placed on the porch sometime during the morning. I had been so focused on the mailbox I had not noticed it. Ranger pawed at it until I opened the door and brought it inside. His tail wagged, something he rarely did for anything besides food or familiar faces. I set the box on the floor and cut the tape. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a set of new toys. A rubber ball, a rugged tug rope, a reinforced collar embroidered with Ranger's name, and beneath them a handwritten note. For the bravest dog I have ever met. The handwriting was hers. Soft, careful, honest in a way her voice had been on the edge of becoming before everything collapsed. Ranger nosed the toys, delighted, unaware of the ache twisting through my chest. I stared at the note until the words blurred, until the weight of them sank into the silence I had been carrying. Lydia had not left in anger. She had not retaliated. She had not even defended herself in the face of my coldness. Instead, she had found a way to say what she could not bring herself to write in the letter on the couch. "Thank you. I am sorry. I did not want to leave this way, and something else too, something I had not expected. I wanted you to know I cared." The truth settled over me slowly, painfully. She had not abandoned me. She had been trying to make things right in the only ways she knew how. Ranger dropped the rubber ball at my feet and looked up at me tail swishing, waiting for me to play. His eyes were bright, full of simple joy, unaware of the wound reopening inside me. I bent down, picked up the ball, and held it in my hand. The gesture was small, but it carried more meaning than anything I had allowed myself to feel in years. Lydia had reached out, with money, with kindness, with a truth she had been terrified to tell, and I in my anger had almost missed what it meant. She had not left to escape me. She had left because she believed staying would hurt me. She believed she did not deserve to be forgiven, and for the first time since she walked out of my cabin, I wondered if I had been wrong. The snow had begun to melt by the time she came back, shrinking from deep drifts into uneven patches that gleamed under the pale afternoon sun. A week had passed since the package and the bank notice, a week of thoughts circling the same questions until they carved a hollow inside me. I tried working on the shed roof, sharpening tools, reorganizing the pantry, cutting firewood, anything to keep my hands busy. But every quiet moment brought me back to her. To the way she had looked at Ranger, as if he were the only creature in the world who understood her. To the truth she had been too afraid to say out loud. To the letter I still had not opened. On a mild day when the air tasted like thawing earth and distant pine, a soft knock sounded at the cabin door. Not urgent, not afraid, just gentle. Ranger was up before I could blink. His ears shot forward, tail rising in an arc, and then he bolted toward the entryway. My chest tightened. Somehow, even before I opened the door, I knew. When I pulled it open, there she was. Lydia. No wheelchair, no makeup, no wedding dress. Just a simple winter coat, boots muddy from the melting snow, and a wool hat pulled low over hair that looked less polished than the last time I saw her. She stood with her hands tucked into her sleeves, shoulders tense but eyes steady. She looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but in the way a person appears after setting something heavy down without knowing whether they have permission to walk away from it. The moment Ranger saw her, he froze. His entire body stilled, his head tilting in disbelief as if he needed a second to confirm what his senses had already told him. Then, with a sound halfway between a bark and a whimper, he launched himself toward her. He nearly knocked her over with the force of his joy. Lydia laughed, startled, and wrapped her arms around him as his tail beat against her legs. She buried her face in his fur for a moment, eyes closing, as if returning to a place she had missed more than she dared admit. I watched from the doorway, feeling something shift painfully in my chest. When she finally looked up at me, her expression softened. "Caleb," she said quietly. I swallowed, my voice rougher than I intended. "Why did you come back?" She hesitated, brushing Ranger's fur from her coat. "I did not come for you. I came for him. I needed to know if he forgave me." Her honesty struck deeper than any apology would have. She was not trying to hide behind charm or excuses. She was standing there, stripped of defenses, letting the truth decide whether she could step forward or should turn away. Ranger, still pressed against her leg, picked up one of the toys she had sent him, the rubber ball. He carried it in his mouth, walked up to her and dropped it gently into her hand. The gesture was simple, instinctive, but its meaning was unmistakable. Forgiveness. Acceptance. A bridge rebuilt without a single word spoken. Lydia's breath trembled. She looked at Ranger as if he had just given her permission to hope again. She whispered, "I missed him." I said nothing because the words that rose inside me were too conflicted, too raw. Ranger returned to her side and nudged her hand again. She smiled at him, then lifted her gaze to mine. Steady but fragile. "I did not expect you to open the door," she said. I almost did not knock. Then why did you? I asked. Because I wanted to say thank you, and I wanted to ask if you were all right. She studied my face for a reaction, but I kept still. She continued softly. You do not owe me kindness. You do not owe me forgiveness, but I needed to tell you that I never meant to hurt you. I nodded slowly, unsure whether the tightness in my chest came from lingering anger or the slow thaw of something else. Lydia shifted her weight, wincing slightly. The movement reminded me that her injury had never been fake. She leaned on the doorway a bit for balance. For a moment, instinct told me to reach out steady her, but I kept my hands at my sides. She noticed. Her eyes dimmed, not with disappointment, but understanding. I am not here to ask for anything, she said. I just wanted to see him, and to say goodbye properly this time. Goodbye. The word scraped through me. Ranger seemed to sense it too. He circled her anxiously, whining softly. She bent to scratch behind his ears. I thought I would leave today without seeing you, she added, but I am glad I did, even if you still need space. Space was easy. Distance was familiar. But watching Ranger curl around her legs as if refusing to let her walk away again, that was harder. Much harder. Lydia took a breath, bracing herself against the wind. The sun reflected off the snow behind her, creating a halo of muted light. She straightened, preparing to leave. But Ranger pushed his ball toward her again, insistent this time. She laughed through a breath that nearly cracked into a sob. Caleb, she said softly, still looking at the dog. He forgave me before you did. Her words landed like a truth I had been avoiding. I stepped forward without realizing it, the distance between us shrinking by inches. She watched me, waiting, not hoping, just waiting. Lydia, I said finally, her breath caught. You do not have to leave. Not yet, not like this. Ranger barked once triumphant tail, slamming the porch. Lydia's eyes glimmered not with victory but relief. I stepped aside, holding the door open. She hesitated only a second before stepping inside the place she had once fled. And somehow, with Ranger walking between us like a bridge rebuilt, the cabin did not feel haunted anymore. It felt like a beginning I did not know I still had room for. The moment Lydia stepped back into the cabin, something shifted in the air. Not dramatically, not with some cinematic flourish, but in a quiet, undeniable way. Like the slow thaw of winter when the first patch of earth appears beneath melting snow. Ranger trotted in ahead of her tail, wagging hard enough to brush against her legs as if guiding her to the exact spot she had slept on days earlier. She followed him with small, careful steps, one hand grazing the wall for balance. I watched her as she moved across the room, and for the first time since the night of the betrayal, my chest did not twist with anger. It tightened with something more complex, something that felt almost like recognition. She paused near the fireplace, the orange glow casting light across her cheeks, making her look warmer, softer, and more human than she had the night she broke whatever fragile trust I had offered. When she turned toward me, I realized she was waiting for permission to sit. The instinct surprised me, but I nodded. She settled onto the rug beside Ranger, folding her legs carefully beneath her, exhaling slowly as if the warmth finally reached her bones. I added another log to the fire, the sparks floating upward before disappearing. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The flames filled the silence, crackling steadily, their reflection dancing in her eyes. When she finally lifted her gaze, her voice was gentle but steady. I do not need your forgiveness, Caleb. Her honesty caught me off guard. She continued, her fingers absently stroking Ranger's fur. I am not here to ask for it. I know I hurt you. I know I should have told the truth from the beginning. I shook my head, slightly unsure how to respond. Lydia shifted to face me fully, her expression open in a way I had not seen before. I only came back because I wanted you to know who I really am. Not the version of me you carried through the storm. Not the broken bride someone tried to force me to become. Just me. Her words settled over me like falling ash. I sat down across from her, leaning against the couch. Ranger stretched out between us, his body a warm, steady line connecting the space we had spent so long pulling apart. I said quietly, "I am still angry." She nodded without flinching. "I know. Anger is honest. Silence is not." I exhaled slowly, letting her words sink into the cracks I had ignored. She reached across Ranger's shoulder with her fingertips brushing the floorboards, her hands close enough to mine that the distance felt intentional, not accidental. I did not pull away. I did not shift closer either. Instead, we let the inches between us fill with the truth neither of us had spoken. Lydia's voice softened. "You said once that you could not save yourself, but you saved me." I shook my head, but she continued, "No, you did. You carried me through a storm that would have killed me. You gave me safety when I did not deserve it. You believed I was worth saving even before you knew who I was, and that matters more than any mistake I made." The firelight flickered across her face, illuminating the sincerity I had refused to see beneath the fear. I rested my elbows on my knees, staring into the flames. "I said, I am not used to letting people in. If I am honest, I do not even know how anymore." Lydia smiled faintly, though it carried sadness. "That is why I came back the way I did. No expectations, no pressure, just honesty. So you could decide for yourself." Ranger rolled onto his back paws in the air, demanding attention. Lydia laughed softly and scratched his chest, her laughter briefly filling the room with warmth that settled somewhere deep inside me. The kind of warmth I had not allowed myself to feel since Hannah. I stood, walked into the kitchen, and reached for the cocoa tin I had not touched since the night she slept here. When I returned with 2 steaming mugs, Lydia looked at me with surprise, then something gentler, something grateful. I handed her one, then sat down again, our knees almost touching. The scent of chocolate and cinnamon rose between us. We drank slowly, quietly. Ranger curled into a half circle, his tail thumping once in approval. Lydia held her mug in both hands and whispered, "I never knew a place could feel this safe." I swallowed the lump in my throat. Safety was not something I had offered anyone in years. Yet here she was saying it with the kind of sincerity that demanded nothing in return. After a long silence, she set her mug down and met my eyes. "Thank you for letting me back in, even if only for tonight." I felt the words before I heard myself speak them. "You do not have to leave tonight." The way she inhaled, sharp, soft, hopeful, told me she had not expected that. Ranger lifted his head as if approving the decision. Lydia whispered, "Then I will stay. Not forever. Not presumptuously. Just for now." I nodded, feeling something inside me loosen for the first time in years. The fire warmed our faces. Ranger settled between us, breathing evenly. In the quiet that followed, I realized something undeniable. Sometimes saving someone does not happen in a single night. Sometimes it does not even feel like saving at all. Sometimes it begins when you finally let someone walk back into your life. And in that moment, with the fire glowing and Ranger sighing contentedly between us, I understood the truth he had known all along. We had not just saved her. She had begun to save us too. There is something about stories like this that reaches into a quiet place inside us, a place we often try not to look at too closely. Maybe it is because life has a way of breaking us in ways no one else can see. Maybe it is because every one of us at some point has carried a weight we could not name, a grief that felt too heavy, or a mistake we feared could never be forgiven. Caleb thought his life had narrowed to a cabin, a dog, and the echo of loss he carried in his chest. Lydia believed her worth was measured by expectations she never asked for. Both of them walked into that storm carrying different kinds of pain, neither expecting that the simple act of surviving a night together would reveal the truth. We forget too easily. Sometimes the people we save end up saving us right back. Ranger, in his own quiet way, understood something many of us overlook. Dogs see past the armor we build. They forgive long before we even dare to. He saw the fear behind Lydia's lie. He saw the grief behind Caleb's silence. And in choosing both of them, he reminded us that trust is not about perfection. It is about presence. About showing up again even when the world has given you every reason not to. If you are listening to this and carrying something heavy, I hope this story touches the part of you that still believes in second chances. You do not have to be perfect to deserve forgiveness. You do not have to be whole to offer kindness. And you do not have to have all the answers before you take the next step forward. Sometimes healing happens in the smallest moments: a shared cup of cocoa, a warm fire on a cold night, or a dog placing a worn-out toy in your hand simply because he wants you to stay a little longer. Life gives us storms we do not choose, but it also gives us people and moments that pull us through them. If this story found you at the right time, maybe that is not an accident. Maybe it is a reminder that you still have more living, more loving, and more forgiving ahead of you than you think. We would truly love to hear how this story touched you. Share your thoughts, your memories, or a moment when someone unexpected helped you find your way again. Your voice might be exactly what another viewer needs today. And if you want more stories of hope, resilience, and the strength it takes to start again, consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you for spending your time with us. And wherever you are tonight, may you find a little warmth, a little quiet, and the courage to let someone back in when life finally brings them to your door.